Picture this. It's the year 570 CE, and in the scorching desert city of Mecca, a child is born who will completely transform the course of human history, not through conquest alone, not through wealth or royal bloodlines, but through a message so powerful it would unite warring tribes, elevate the status of women, spark a golden age of science and mathematics, and create one of the world's most influential civilizations. This child's name was Muhammad, and what he achieved in just 23 years of preaching would reshape the world forever. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this story. When Muhammad began receiving his revelations at age 40, he wasn't born into power. He was an orphan. He had no army, no kingdom, no inherited authority. Yet, by the time of his death in 632 CE, he had unified the entire Arabian Peninsula and set in motion events that would create an empire stretching from Spain to India within a century. But that's just the beginning. The real question is this: how did one man's teachings create the conditions for the most scientifically advanced civilization of the medieval world? How did his message lead to mathematical breakthroughs that gave us algebra and algorithms? How did his principles establish some of history's most progressive laws regarding women's rights, religious tolerance, and social justice? And why do over 1.8 billion people today still follow his teachings? The answer lies in understanding something most people completely miss about Muhammad's impact. This wasn't just about religion. This was about revolutionizing every aspect of human society, from how people treated each other to how they understood the natural world around them. Now, to truly grasp the magnitude of what Muhammad accomplished, we need to understand where he started. In 6th century Arabia, the landscape was harsh and unforgiving. Tribal warfare was constant. Women had virtually no rights. Female infanticide was commonplace. The strong dominated the weak, and survival depended on which tribe you belonged to. This was a world where might made right, and unity seemed impossible. Into this world was born Muhammad ibn Abdullah around 570 CE in the bustling trade city of Mecca. He belonged to the Banu Hashim clan, part of the powerful Quraysh tribe that controlled Mecca and its sacred Kaaba shrine. But here's the crucial detail. Despite being born into this influential tribe, Muhammad's early life was marked by loss and hardship. His father Abdullah died before Muhammad was even born. His mother Amina died when he was just 6 years old. His grandfather Abdul Muttalib, who had taken him in, died when Muhammad was 8. This left him in the care of his uncle Abu Talib. And while Abu Talib protected him, Muhammad grew up without the wealth and status that typically came with Quraysh lineage. Yet even in his youth, something set Muhammad apart. He earned the nickname Al-Amin, meaning the trustworthy, and Al-Sadiq, meaning the truthful. In a society where deception and broken promises were common in business dealings, Muhammad's reputation for honesty became legendary. When disputes arose among the Meccan tribes, they would often ask Muhammad to mediate because they trusted his judgment. This reputation caught the attention of Khadija, a wealthy widow who ran successful trading caravans. She hired Muhammad to manage her business affairs, and she was so impressed by his integrity and skill that she proposed marriage to him. Now, this detail is crucial because it tells us something important about the society Muhammad would later transform. Here was a woman in 6th century Arabia who owned and operated her own business, who had the autonomy to choose her own husband. Khadija was 40 years old, Muhammad was 25, and their marriage would become one of the most significant partnerships in history. For the next 15 years, Muhammad lived as a successful merchant. He and Khadija had 6 children together, and by all accounts, their marriage was built on love, mutual respect, and genuine partnership. But during this period, Muhammad began to feel increasingly troubled by the injustices he witnessed in Meccan society. The Quraysh tribe had grown wealthy by controlling the trade routes that passed through Mecca, and they had turned the city into a major commercial hub. The Kaaba, an ancient cube-shaped structure at the center of Mecca, housed the idols of hundreds of different deities, making it a pilgrimage destination that brought visitors and revenue from across Arabia. The Quraysh had essentially monetized religion, charging fees for pilgrims to worship at the shrine. But this economic success came at a cost. The gap between rich and poor had grown enormous. Wealthy merchants lived in luxury, while many struggled to survive. The tribal system meant that your worth as a person depended entirely on which family you were born into. Women were treated as property, passed from fathers to husbands like valuable commodities. Slaves had no rights whatsoever. The strong oppressed the weak with impunity. Muhammad watched all of this unfold around him, and it deeply disturbed him. He began spending more and more time in solitary reflection, often retreating to a cave called Hira in the mountains outside Mecca. There, away from the noise and corruption of the city, he would meditate on the problems plaguing his society and search for answers. It was during one of these retreats, in the year 610 CE, that Muhammad's life changed forever. According to Islamic tradition, while he was meditating in the cave of Hira, he received his first revelation from God through the angel Gabriel. The angel commanded him to recite "In the name of your Lord who created." This marked the beginning of a 23-year period during which Muhammad would receive the revelations that would become the Quran. But here's what makes this moment so remarkable. The very first word revealed to Muhammad was Iqra, which means read or recite. In a largely illiterate society, the emphasis on reading and knowledge was revolutionary. This wasn't just a spiritual awakening. It was the beginning of an intellectual revolution that would eventually create the most advanced civilization of its time. Muhammad was terrified by this first experience. He rushed home to Khadija, trembling and asking her to cover him with blankets. But Khadija's response reveals something profound about both her character and the nature of their relationship. She didn't dismiss his experience or suggest he was losing his mind. Instead, she reassured him, telling him that God would never forsake him because of his good character and the way he cared for others. Khadija became the first person to accept Muhammad's message, followed by his young cousin Ali and his close friend Abu Bakr. But for the first 3 years, Muhammad shared his revelations only with his family and closest friend. The message he received was radical for its time. There was only one God. All human beings were equal in God's sight, regardless of their tribe or social status. The wealthy had obligations to care for the poor, and everyone would be held accountable for their actions in this life. When Muhammad finally began preaching publicly in Mecca around 613 CE, the reaction was explosive. The Quraysh elite immediately recognized the threat his message posed to their power and wealth. If people believed that all humans were equal, regardless of their tribal affiliation, the entire social hierarchy that kept the Quraysh in power would crumble. If the wealthy were obligated to share their wealth with the poor, their accumulation of riches would be challenged. If there was only one God, the lucrative pilgrimage business built around the multiple idols in the Kaaba would collapse. The opposition to Muhammad wasn't just religious, it was economic and political. The Quraysh began a campaign of persecution against Muhammad and his followers that would last for years. They boycotted his family's businesses, spread rumors about his sanity, and physically attacked converts to his message. Some of his followers were tortured, others were forced to flee Mecca entirely. But something extraordinary was happening despite this persecution. Muhammad's message was spreading, and it was transforming the people who heard it in ways that went far beyond simple religious conversion. The transformation wasn't just spiritual, it was social, intellectual, and deeply practical. Take Bilal ibn Rabah, for example. He was an Ethiopian slave who was brutally tortured by his master for accepting Muhammad's message. His owner would drag him onto the burning sand in the heat of the day, place a heavy stone on his chest, and demand that he renounce his faith. But Bilal would only repeat Ahad, Ahad, meaning one, referring to the oneness of God. When Abu Bakr heard about this, he purchased Bilal's freedom, and later, Muhammad appointed him as the first person to call believers to prayer. Think about what this meant. A former slave, a man with no tribal status whatsoever, was given one of the most honored positions in the emerging Muslim community. This wasn't an isolated incident. Muhammad's message was creating a completely new social order, based on merit, character, and piety rather than birth, wealth, or tribal connections. But the Quraysh weren't about to let their power slip away without a fight. The persecution intensified dramatically. In what became known as the Year of Sorrow, both Muhammad's beloved wife Khadija and his protective uncle Abu Talib died within months of each other. Khadija had been his emotional anchor and financial supporter for 25 years. Abu Talib, while never converting to Islam himself, had shielded Muhammad from the worst of the Quraysh's wrath because of family loyalty. With both of them gone, Muhammad found himself more vulnerable than ever. The Quraysh saw their opportunity. They increased the pressure, making life nearly impossible for Muhammad and his followers in Mecca. Some of the early Muslims had already fled to Abyssinia, a Christian kingdom across the Red Sea, where they found protection under a just ruler. But Muhammad needed a different solution. That solution came from an unexpected source: the city of Yathrib, located about 200 miles north of Mecca. Yathrib was caught in a cycle of tribal warfare between two main Arab tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj, with several Jewish tribes also living in the city. The constant fighting had left everyone exhausted, and they were desperately seeking someone who could mediate their disputes and bring peace. Representatives from Yathrib had heard about Muhammad's reputation as a fair mediator and his message of unity. In a series of secret meetings, they invited him to come to their city, not just as a religious leader, but as their political leader as well. They pledged to protect him and his followers, and to accept his arbitration in their disputes. This led to one of the most pivotal moments in human history, the Hijra, or migration to Medina, in 622 CE. This wasn't just a change of location. It was the moment when Muhammad's teachings began to create an entirely new form of civilization. But the journey itself was fraught with danger. The Quraysh had discovered the plan and were determined to stop Muhammad from escaping. They surrounded his house, planning to kill him as he emerged. But Muhammad and Abu Bakr managed to slip away in the darkness, hiding in a cave for 3 days while search parties combed the desert looking for them. When they finally reached Yathrib, which was renamed Medina al-Nabi, meaning the city of the Prophet, Muhammad faced an enormous challenge. He had to unite warring tribes, establish a new form of government, and create a society based on his revolutionary principles. What he accomplished in Medina would become the blueprint for one of history's most remarkable civilizations. The first thing Muhammad did was create what historians now call the Constitution of Medina. This document was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It established a unified political community that included not just the Muslim emigrants from Mecca and the Muslim converts in Medina, but also the Jewish tribes and even some pagan groups who chose to remain in the city. The Constitution guaranteed religious freedom for all communities, while establishing Muhammad as the final arbiter of disputes. It created mutual defense obligations and established principles of justice that applied equally to all citizens, regardless of their religion or tribal affiliation. Jewish tribes could follow their own laws in religious matters, but everyone was bound by the same civil laws when it came to crimes and disputes between different communities. This was revolutionary. In a world where religious and ethnic differences typically led to warfare and oppression, Muhammad had created a pluralistic society where diversity was not just tolerated but protected by law. The Jewish scholar Bernard Lewis called it the first example in history of a society based on the principle of religious plurality. But Muhammad wasn't just creating a new political system, he was transforming the very fabric of society. In Medina, he established the first Islamic principles of women's rights, economic justice, and social welfare that would later influence legal systems across the world. Consider what happened to women's status under Muhammad's teachings. In pre-Islamic Arabia, women could be inherited like property when their husbands died. They had no right to own property, no say in whom they married, and no legal protection from abuse. Female infanticide was common because daughters were seen as economic burdens. Muhammad changed all of this. The Quran explicitly prohibited female infanticide, declaring that both sons and daughters were gifts from God. Women gained the right to own property, to inherit wealth, to choose their husbands, and to initiate divorce under certain circumstances. They could engage in business, as Khadija had done, and their consent was required for marriage. Muhammad's own daughter, Fatima, became a powerful example of women's elevated status. She was consulted on important community matters, spoke publicly about social issues, and was revered for her wisdom and character. When she disagreed with decisions made by the community leaders after Muhammad's death, her opinions carried significant weight in political discussions. The economic reforms were equally transformative. Muhammad established the principle of zakat, a mandatory wealth redistribution system where those with means were required to give a percentage of their wealth to support the poor, orphans, and other vulnerable members of society. This wasn't voluntary charity. It was a legal obligation that created the world's first systematic approach to poverty reduction. But perhaps most remarkably, Muhammad was laying the intellectual foundations for what would become history's greatest scientific revolution. The Quran repeatedly emphasized the importance of knowledge, observation, and reasoning. It described the natural world as full of signs that humans should study and understand. It encouraged believers to travel, to learn from other cultures, and to seek knowledge wherever they could find it. The famous hadith, or saying of Muhammad, "Seek knowledge even if you have to go to China," wasn't just about religious knowledge. It was a call for Muslims to pursue all forms of learning, including what we would today call science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. This emphasis on learning created something unprecedented, a religion that saw the pursuit of knowledge as a form of worship. Within a few generations, this would lead to the establishment of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where scholars from around the world would gather to translate, preserve, and expand upon the knowledge of ancient civilizations while making revolutionary discoveries of their own. The impact of these intellectual foundations was already becoming apparent during Muhammad's lifetime in Medina. The early Muslim community developed sophisticated systems of record-keeping, established principles of evidence-based decision-making, and created educational institutions where both men and women could learn to read and write. Meanwhile, the conflict with Mecca was far from over. The Quraysh couldn't tolerate the existence of Muhammad's new society in Medina because it represented an existential threat to everything their power was built upon. If Muhammad's egalitarian message continued to spread, their entire system of tribal hierarchy and economic exploitation would collapse. This led to a series of military confrontations that would test whether Muhammad's new civilization could survive against the established powers of the old world. But these weren't just battles between armies. They were clashes between two completely different visions of how human society should be organized. The first major confrontation came at the Battle of Badr in 624 CE, where Muhammad's small force of around 300 men faced a much larger Meccan army. Against all odds, the Muslims achieved a decisive victory that sent shockwaves throughout Arabia. Suddenly, other tribes began to take notice of this new power emerging from Medina, but victory brought new challenges. How do you maintain revolutionary principles while building a state? How do you balance justice with pragmatism? How do you create lasting institutions that will preserve your vision for future generations? Muhammad's answers to these questions would determine whether his movement would become just another tribal confederation or the foundation of a civilization that would reshape the world. The answers Muhammad provided would prove to be nothing short of revolutionary. As news of the victory at Badr spread across the Arabian Peninsula, something extraordinary began happening. Tribes that had spent centuries locked in blood feuds started sending delegations to Medina, not to challenge Muhammad's authority, but to understand this new system that could unite former enemies under a single banner. But here's what's truly remarkable about what happened next. Muhammad didn't simply conquer and impose his will. Instead, he began implementing a systematic transformation of Arabian society that would create the intellectual and social foundations for one of history's most advanced civilizations. Take the way he handled justice, for example. In pre-Islamic Arabia, if someone from your tribe was killed, you could kill anyone from the perpetrator's tribe in retaliation. This system of collective punishment meant that conflicts could escalate for generations, with entire families wiped out over disputes that began decades earlier. Muhammad introduced something radical: the principle of individual accountability. Only the person who committed a crime could be punished for it. Moreover, he established that the punishment must fit the crime exactly, and he consistently encouraged forgiveness and compensation over retaliation. This wasn't just about being merciful. It was about breaking the cycles of violence that had plagued Arabian society for centuries. The transformation went even deeper. Muhammad began establishing what we would recognize today as the world's first comprehensive legal framework based on evidence and testimony rather than tribal loyalty or personal vendettas. Witnesses were required to swear oaths, evidence had to be examined carefully, and the accused had the right to defend themselves. For a society that had operated on the principle that might makes right, this was absolutely revolutionary. But the most profound changes were happening in how people understood knowledge itself. The Quran that Muhammad was receiving didn't just contain spiritual guidance, it was filled with observations about the natural world that encouraged scientific thinking. It described the water cycle, the development of human embryos, the movement of celestial bodies, and the geological formation of mountains in ways that encouraged believers to observe and study these phenomena. This created something unprecedented in human history, a religious worldview that saw the pursuit of natural knowledge as a form of worship. While other societies often viewed scientific inquiry as potentially threatening to religious belief, Islam made the study of God's creation a religious obligation. The Quran repeatedly used the Arabic word ayat, meaning signs, to describe both its verses and the phenomena of the natural world, suggesting that studying nature was as important as studying scripture. The practical effects of this worldview were already becoming apparent in Medina. Muhammad established schools where both men and women learned not just religious texts, but also mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. He encouraged his followers to learn from traders and travelers who brought knowledge from other civilizations. When Muslim armies later conquered territories, they were instructed to preserve libraries and protect scholars rather than destroy them. This emphasis on learning created a culture of intellectual curiosity that would prove crucial in the centuries to come. But it wasn't just abstract knowledge that Muhammad was promoting. He was establishing practical systems that would support scientific advancement for generations. Consider the institution of waqf, or religious endowments, that Muhammad established in Medina. Wealthy Muslims were encouraged to donate land, buildings, or money to create permanent foundations that would fund schools, hospitals, libraries, and research institutions. Unlike temporary charitable giving, these endowments were designed to generate income in perpetuity, creating a sustainable funding system for intellectual pursuits that didn't depend on the whims of rulers or the fluctuations of state budgets. The first major waqf was established by Muhammad himself when he designated land in Medina for a mosque that also served as a school and community center. But the concept quickly expanded. Within a few generations, the Islamic world would have thousands of these endowments funding everything from astronomical observatories to medical colleges to libraries that preserved and translated texts from around the world. Meanwhile, the status of women was undergoing a transformation that wouldn't be matched in other societies for centuries. Muhammad's wife Aisha, whom he married after Khadija's death, became one of the most important scholars and teachers in early Islamic history. She memorized thousands of Muhammad's sayings, became an expert in Islamic law, and taught both men and women. After Muhammad's death, people would travel from across the Islamic world to seek her opinions on legal and theological questions. This wasn't unusual. Women in early Islamic society regularly participated in business, education, and even warfare. They could own property independently of their husbands, they had legal rights in divorce proceedings, and they were entitled to inherit wealth. The Quran explicitly stated that women who achieved spiritual and moral excellence would receive the same rewards as men, establishing a principle of spiritual equality that was revolutionary for its time. But perhaps the most significant change was in how society understood the relationship between different social classes. The tribal system that had dominated Arabia was based on the idea that some people were inherently superior to others based on their bloodlines. Muhammad's teachings completely rejected this concept. His famous farewell sermon, delivered to over 100,000 pilgrims during his final pilgrimage to Mecca, included these words: "All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a non-Arab have any superiority over an Arab. A white has no superiority over a black, nor does a black have any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. This wasn't just rhetoric. Muhammad consistently appointed people to leadership positions based on their ability and character, rather than their tribal affiliations. Bilal, the former Ethiopian slave, became one of his most trusted companions. Salman, the Persian, a former slave from another culture entirely, was considered part of Muhammad's family. When Muhammad conquered Mecca and could have taken revenge on his former persecutors, he instead granted general amnesty and appointed several former enemies to important positions. The economic system Muhammad established was equally revolutionary. The prohibition of usury, or charging interest on loans, was designed to prevent the concentration of wealth that had characterized Meccan society. Instead, Islam encouraged profit-sharing partnerships and trade relationships that distributed economic benefits more broadly. The institution of zakat went beyond simple charity. It was a systematic wealth redistribution system that created what economists would recognize today as an early form of social safety net. But it wasn't administered by the government alone. It was a community obligation that created networks of mutual support and responsibility. These economic principles had profound implications for how Islamic societies would develop. By encouraging trade while discouraging exploitation, by promoting education while ensuring that learning wasn't limited to the wealthy, by establishing legal systems that protected property rights while ensuring that wealth was shared with those in need, Muhammad was creating the conditions for sustainable economic growth and social stability. The effects were already visible during his lifetime. Medina transformed from a city torn apart by tribal warfare into a thriving center of trade and learning. People from across Arabia came not just for pilgrimage, but for education, business opportunities, and the fair resolution of disputes. The city became a model that other communities sought to emulate. But the true test of Muhammad's system came as his influence spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula. When Muslim armies began expanding into the territories of the Byzantine and Persian empires, they carried with them not just military might, but a comprehensive vision of how society should be organized. Unlike previous conquerors who had simply imposed their rule on subject populations, Muslim armies offered something different. Conversion to Islam was voluntary, existing religious communities were protected, and local customs were preserved as long as they didn't conflict with basic Islamic principles. The result was that many people in conquered territories welcomed Muslim rule because it offered greater religious freedom and social justice than they had experienced under previous rulers. The Christian communities of Syria and Egypt, for example, had suffered under Byzantine persecution because they followed different theological doctrines than the official state church. Under Muslim rule, they were free to practice their faith and even maintain their own legal systems for personal matters like marriage and inheritance. Jewish communities that had faced discrimination and occasional violence under Christian and Persian rule found themselves protected and often prosperous under Islamic law. They could build synagogues, practice their religion freely, and participate in business and intellectual life on an equal footing with Muslims. This policy of religious tolerance wasn't just pragmatic, it reflected the fundamental principles that Muhammad had established in the Constitution of Medina. The Quran explicitly recognized Christians and Jews as people of the book who worship the same God as Muslims, and it commanded Muslims to protect their places of worship and respect their traditions. The intellectual implications of this tolerance were enormous. When Muslim scholars encountered Greek philosophical texts in conquered territories, they didn't destroy them as threats to Islamic belief. Instead, they translated them, studied them, and used them as starting points for their own philosophical and scientific investigations. When they discovered Indian mathematical concepts like the decimal number system and the concept of zero, they didn't reject them as foreign innovations. Instead, they incorporated these ideas into Islamic scholarship and used them to make revolutionary advances in mathematics and astronomy. This openness to learning from other cultures, combined with the Islamic emphasis on observation and reasoning, created an intellectual environment unlike anything the world had ever seen. Within a century of Muhammad's death, Muslim scholars were making groundbreaking discoveries in fields ranging from medicine to chemistry to optics. But the foundation for all of this had been laid during Muhammad's lifetime in Medina. The legal framework that protected scholars, the economic system that funded research, the social structure that valued learning, and the theological framework that saw the pursuit of knowledge as a form of worship, all of these elements had been established by the time of his death in 632 CE. The speed of this transformation was breathtaking. In just 23 years, Muhammad had taken a collection of warring tribes in one of the world's most isolated regions and created the intellectual, social, and institutional foundations for what would become the most advanced civilization of the medieval world. By the time Muhammad made his final pilgrimage to Mecca in 632 CE, the entire Arabian Peninsula had been transformed. The Kaaba, which had once housed hundreds of idols representing different tribal deities, had been cleansed and rededicated to the worship of one God. The pilgrimage itself had been reformed from a chaotic gathering of competing tribes into an organized demonstration of unity and equality. But Muhammad knew that his real legacy wouldn't be the political unity of Arabia. It would be the ideas, institutions, and principles that would guide his followers long after his death. In his farewell sermon, he emphasized that his followers should hold fast to the Quran and his example, but he also made it clear that they would need to use their own reasoning and judgment as they applied these principles to new situations and challenges. This emphasis on intellectual independence, combined with the systematic approach to knowledge that he had established, would prove to be one of his most important contributions to human civilization. Within a few generations, Muslim scholars would be pushing the boundaries of human knowledge in ways that would benefit all of humanity. The mathematical innovations that emerged from Islamic civilization would give us algebra, algorithms, and trigonometry. The medical advances would establish principles of surgery, pharmacology, and public health that would influence medical practice for centuries. The philosophical investigations would preserve and expand upon Greek thought while developing new approaches to logic, ethics, and metaphysics. But all of this intellectual achievement rested on the social and institutional foundations that Muhammad had established during his lifetime. The protection of religious minorities, the elevation of women's status, the systematic approach to education, the legal framework that valued evidence and reasoning, the economic system that encouraged both prosperity and social responsibility, these were the building blocks upon which Islamic civilization would be constructed. As Muhammad lay dying in the arms of his beloved wife, Aisha, in 632 CE, he could hardly have imagined the full scope of what his teachings would accomplish. But the principles he had established, the community he had built, and the intellectual revolution he had begun would continue to shape human history for centuries to come. The boy born into the harsh desert world of 6th century Arabia had indeed transformed civilization itself, but the story of that transformation was just beginning. From a single orphan in the Arabian desert to the founder of a civilization that would preserve human knowledge during Europe's darkest centuries, Muhammad's transformation of the world stands as one of history's most remarkable achievements. In just 23 years, he didn't just create a religion, he revolutionized human society itself, establishing principles of equality, justice, and intellectual freedom that continue to influence over 1.8 billion people today. The mathematical breakthroughs, medical advances, and scientific methods that emerged from his teachings shaped the modern world in ways most people never realize. What do you think was Muhammad's most significant contribution to civilization? Let us know in the comments. If this story of transformation inspired you, make sure to subscribe for more incredible tales of how individuals changed the course of human history.